Good afternoon and welcome to the afternoon conference. My name is Max Mayfield. I'm the Hurricane Specialist for WPLG-TV in Miami, former Director of the National Hurricane Center, and also the Vice Chair of this year's National Hurricane Conference. I think we're going to do something very different at this session. We're going to concentrate on resiliency, a term that I'm thrilled to hear during several of the talks and even rap sessions so far this conference. And we're very fortunate to have our moderator of this particular session, Chapman Henderson, who is the president and CEO of the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, FLASH, which is the country's leading consumer advocate for strengthening homes and safeguarding families from natural and man-made disasters. Ms. Chapman Henderson and FLASH have championed the cause of disaster-resilient construction methods, and Leslie is actually doing a really good job in FLASH, not just on hurricanes, but all types of disasters, and she goes all over the country making contacts and educating people. I can't keep up with her in all her travels here. She's also the only person I know who visited Downton Abbey in England, and not too many days after that was testifying before a United Nations sponsored workshop on resilient building. So let's welcome Leslie Chapman Henderson.
Thank you, Max. I thought that going to the UN last year was the big one. Of course, the Downton Abbey was not part of my job, so let's make that clear before I get in trouble. But after that, this year, we did something that we found very encouraging for the whole cause of disaster safety, and we were crowdsourced onto a panel at South by Southwest. Anybody here familiar with South by Southwest? I know you guys are. Well, that's a sign. And it's a good one, because that means maybe our cause is becoming cool. And as we've said for many, many years, that's what it's all about. If we're going to make and promote a social change and change the way that we deliver safety or resilience or we help communities bounce back, we have to be part of ordinary life, and some of that involves being cool. I'm not personally cool. I'm too old to worry about trying, but I have aspirations for all of you. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today. And in the last general session, if you were here as well, you heard the word resilience many, many, many times. I come to this after 30 years on the front line and in all different angles of disaster safety, 10 in the insurance industry and 16 with the Federal Alliance. And frankly, when I think about resilience, and I organized this group of fine folks here to come talk about it, because even when you look at the program for the conference, we all come with our specific area of operation, okay? Some people are journalists, we have meteorologists, engineers, emergency managers, code officials, design professionals, but everybody's really good in their role, and we come together every year and talk about how can we work better together. Well, in our world, at the Federal Alliance, it's about safer, better built homes. So what is that? Building codes, design, practices, helping people understand what to ask for in the marketplace. But then we go away and we haven't been unified. So in the post-Superstorm Hurricane Sandy era, the word resilience has come onto the scene, and we've done some testing, and we do that, and we talk to people, and the change, the game changer that we see and what we're pretty excited about, and we tend to be pretty half full glass kind of people anyway, is that resilience, and this is what people told us, resilience is a desired end state, okay? As opposed to an important task that's a building block of resilience, which we all have those, whether it's forecasting or designing, etc. Resilience is something that can be used as a type of rallying cry, and I think it can help us break down some of the barriers where people say, well, this is what I do, this is my role, and I don't want to look beyond that into other people's stuff, because my cup is full and runneth over with my work. So the idea here today is to talk about resilience and then how we can move people, and here's the other thing. There are lots of definitions of resilience percolating out there, okay? In fact, some really smart think tanks have spent a couple years and lots of money trying to even define resilience. So I'm going to take advantage of having the microphone and tell you what our definition is, and it's basically the ability for a community to bounce back, and for today's purposes, from a hurricane, okay? That's the test, that's the standard, that's the measure of success. If the community, we can't prevent the hurricane, but can we shorten the recovery time? Can we improve the survival rate? Can we reduce the number of injuries? What are the things we can do to position ourselves in the best and strongest place to create resilient communities? And how can people look past their traditional role to help each other? If you're an emergency manager, are you talking to your code official and asking, hey, do we have the latest model building codes in place? It's maybe in some emergency managers' minds exactly within their role to ask that. And if it's not in your mind and you're in that role, I would encourage you to do that. But to look beyond our own purview and consider how we can drive resilience ourselves. And you guys have heard me say this before, but in our country and in our society, we've talked years ago about a culture of prevention. I think we remember Governor Bush talking about that. Wendy used to work for the governor. And a culture of prevention really is something that passes on a way to a resilient state. And in our country and in our world, we're really good at the culture of prevention, but our timing is terrible. We're really good at it after bad things happen, okay? So what we see in post-Sandy communities is a real awareness and drive, and it's tricky to sustain it. We see it, you know, better building codes came to Florida after Andrew in '92. Post-Hurricane Katrina, we saw some things happen differently. Building codes were adopted there. Some of them were abandoned. So I think the key here is to take whatever we can do and change the way we pursue a better system of delivering all the services that come to bear to keep people safe and communities intact. And I'm going to just put forth the magic potion is a pursuit of resilience. So I want to give you 3 things that from our focus in our area of operation can drive resilience and give you a couple things to think about. And then I'm going to bring up our panelists. All of these folks they've distinguished themselves as individuals in their professional fields and are at the top of their fields. But the reason we recruit them for this is their philosophy and their willingness to help others and to break down barriers, even if it's not within your purview as an architect, Illya. The leadership has been very clear. So I think you're going to really enjoy them. 3 things to think about in our perspective on resilience. 1 is policy leadership. We all talk about building codes and good decision making, but are we really getting down to the details? And I would urge you to go to your community and find out if it's just talk or if your community does in fact have the latest model building codes in place, and are they being enforced? Creating public value. We talked this morning in our wrap session with all the host of communicators from the journalism, the PIOs, the leadership. We have got to get on board with creating a public value for disaster safety and resilience. And we do that a lot of different ways, some of which we can talk about here today. The third thing is also, I think, a little revolutionary in our space, but not in the academic world and the world of tech and beyond. And that's keeping a very transparent and open source approach to the information that we have. The provision of university textbooks has been revolutionized by a professor at Rice University, so much so that very, very poor individuals in Pakistan can now take trigonometry because the cost of those books has come down. At Flash, we created a website last year, and many of you are using it. It's called mitigationmovement.org. It's a non-branded, open source website to share tools, techniques, what worked, what didn't. It's this kind of approach, I think, that's going to get us into the collaboration zone and really help drive the breakthroughs. Some very smart people, one in particular, has reminded us for many years, we can't always care why we win, because it might just be serendipity. Despite our best plans, despite our best science, despite the logic, sometimes when we get it right, it's just a happy accident. So if we can continue to share information and be very generous in how we support each other's roles, I do think we can really break this cycle that we've been working to break for more than 20 years, at least in my part, 30 years. The build, destroy, rebuild it the same way, we got to do better, okay? So I'd like to bring up our first panelist, and grab her bio. She serves as the CEO of the Corporation for National and Community Service, which is a federal agency that administers some programs that you probably all know and love. AmeriCorps, Senior Corps, the Social Innovation Fund, and many other programs, which together engage more than 5 million Americans in service and volunteering to improve lives, strengthen communities, and foster civic engagement. Once upon a time, this fine individual served on our board of directors at the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, but as often happens in life, in June of 2013, she got a better offer. She was named by President Obama as the co-chair of the President's Task Force to expand national service and create more opportunities for Americans to participate in national service. Under her leadership, CNCS has launched new partnerships, including FEMA Corps, School Turnaround AmeriCorps, STEM AmeriCorps, Vet Success AmeriCorps, and Financial Opportunity Corps. She's fantastic. She's dedicated more than 30 years and her incredible leadership skills to the cause of community service, and she's personally responsible for many of the successes that we've all enjoyed. Please welcome Wendy Spencer.
Thanks, Leslie. Thank you. Thanks, Leslie, and all the great work that Flash is doing. It's just amazing. So I don't want you to give up on aspiring to be cool, because I'm not giving up on it, and I'm going to keep working on trying to be cool. So I've got to figure out how to do that. I don't know what the secret is, but I'm not giving up. I refuse to do so. It's great to be here today and to talk with all you great professionals. So I've got a resilience resource ready-made for all of you. And it's in the form of something unique and different that you don't think about, and it's right in your neighborhoods or it's very near you. And it's in the form of AmeriCorps members, Senior Corps volunteers, believe it or not, even RSVP, foster grandparents, VISTA, AmeriCorps MCCC, and now the new AmeriCorps program called FEMA Corps. I'm going to give you the numbers on that in a minute. But this tool, this resource is right at your fingertips, and you may not have even known it. And it's going to help you make your community more resilient and be able to bounce back quicker once you are hit by any kind of peril, quite frankly. I did cut my teeth on disaster work with Craig Fugate, working very closely with Governor Bush back in 2004 and 2005, and we had all the storms that we were dealing with together. And one thing that I love about Craig, that he always says that, and there's lots of Craiganites that we talk about, but one of them is that he says, you know, that responding to hurricanes in any disaster is a team sport. It's not an individual sport, it's a team sport, and everyone has to play a part. Everyone has to play a part. And that's what my role is today, is to talk about how citizen engagement through national service and volunteerism can play a part. There's another, and I'm going to click this, Craiganite that we say is, you know, we're not right and ready until the Waffle House is open. I should have put a big stamp on there that said open for business. Now, while national service is probably not going to open up a Waffle House, we are very closely going to be helping nonprofits get back to open, schools, houses of faith, communities, neighborhoods, individual citizens who need support from trained national service participants. And here's our landscape, if you will, with AmeriCorps and Senior Corps. 75,000 current AmeriCorps members today, serving 315,000 seniors. So if you're 55 or older, I can sign you up after the event today. Social Innovation Fund is a new grant we're providing, very large grants to nonprofits to scale proven practices, and then generating new volunteers to the Volunteer Generation Fund. If you take those 400,000 or so enrolled national service participants, we're in 60,000 locations across America. So we're in your neighborhood easily, or someone very near you. And as Leslie mentioned, we're engaging really a total of 5 million Americans in service because our AmeriCorps members and Senior Corps participants are recruiting volunteers to serve alongside them as well. So this is a big, big part of our work. I want to, as Chris tees this up, the video up for you, I want to paint a picture through a video, a 3-minute video that's going to show you and demonstrate some of our work. And I want you to see, if you visualize yourself receiving some of the hands of the effort that you'll see on this video. Thanks, Chris. What's special about that? None of those activities that you visualized there or saw on the screen was done outside of the emergency manager's consultation. Every one of those activities was done at the request of or in prior collaboration in advance, during, and post the peril. That's what's important here, is that we are connecting with and through you to help you become stronger emergency management professionals so that you can respond and help your communities hasten your ability to get your community back, not only back to normalcy, but back even better. And so we're working with emergency managers, with mayors and commissioners, with law enforcement personnel, with the military, with other partners at the local level, National VOAD. There's representatives here today from National VOAD that we would not even attempt to do our work without them being very closely with us. So with this, we've got now, so that's the big picture. Now let me drill down to our trained personnel, our trained human capital. Today we have 4,200 AmeriCorps members trained in intensive disaster preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery work. We have 1,200, well, like 1,400. It changes every day, but now we've got up to 1,400 this month. 1,400 FEMA Corps. These are 18 to 24-year-olds. 18 to 24-year-olds that are now being trained, weeks of training, positioned in 5 states regionally: Colorado, San Francisco, or Sacramento, Maryland, Mississippi, and Iowa. And they're deployed in groups of 10 out to disasters to help with all kinds of work, and I'm going to elaborate that in a minute. And then if you add the senior corps professionals with us, if you take everyone, we've got access to those 400,000 that I mentioned, but these are the ones that are really well trained. Since 2011, we've had 10,000 trained AmeriCorps members and senior corps volunteers who have recruited and managed 150,000 volunteers just in the last 2.5 years in disasters. So that's a little bit of our footprint. And this is actually those 150,000 volunteers. Many of these are spontaneous. Many of them arrived on the scene without a role, and we quickly, working with the local emergency manager, were able to get them engaged appropriately, which, as you know, it could be another crisis if we don't do something about that. So I think that's one of the advantages that we offer as well. Really, national service is national resilience. 2 reasons. 1, by pairing our resources with your deep institutional knowledge of how to support the community's response immediately after a disaster is important. But also, as I mentioned, engaging those volunteers so that they work for you, not against you. Donations management, so it works for you, not against you. That's something that we can come in and work closely with the volunteer organizations active in disaster and other first responders as well to make sure that it's done right. A couple of examples I want to give you just in the last couple of years. This is a hurricane conference, but I'm going to give you some other perils because it's the same applications. Oso, Washington mudslide just recently. There's a gap in this case, and in oftentimes, between when the disaster occurs and when you have a fully declared federal disaster, a declaration for PA and I and the full declaration. You can't wait on it. We still got to respond and help. And sometimes that's the greatest hour of need, are those days and hours post the disaster. So 3 days after, at the request being recruited by the Northwest Washington Incident Management Team, we had 45 highly trained, highly skilled Washington Conservation Corps AmeriCorps members come in and help with some areas that are a little bit different than you would normally think. Resource delivery and ordering. They were placed in the logistics section. Base camp management, security and traffic control, believe it or not. Donations management, of course, a real sweet spot for us. Responder feeding operations, taking care of your first responders first. Volunteer management, of course. And here's the agencies, the organizations we help: the fire department, the public works department there, the Washington State DOT, State Patrol, Sheriff's Deputy Department, the emergency management, the Natural Resources Office. All of these came in coordinated effort with that incident management organization. That I just really love that example because high need there, big gap, weeks between the incident and the actual declaration that occurred there. Hurricane Sandy and floods, I have, of course, the picture with the floods is very common. Hurricane Sandy, which we've talked to a lot about this morning, today, we had 4,000 national service members have responded, and we're still there. We're actually still there, still responding. I did an augmentation grant to place more AmeriCorps members at about the 6 month after the disaster hit, working very closely with Red Cross. We actually helped them manage 45 shelters. Many of those were through the New York City Emergency Management Department. 7 volunteer reception centers operated there, thousands of volunteers managed. The one thing we needed in this disaster that was unique to me, being from the South and serving in Florida, coats in the winter, because we were serving and I mean, it was awful. We were there working in very, very cold, difficult situations, and children had lost a lot of things, especially children. So recruited and distributed 115,000 coats, mucked out and gutted homes. And we did this also at the hands of support from the private sector. Time Warner supported us. Southwest Airlines actually deployed, helped transport our AmeriCorps members across the country so we could get in very quickly. So New York and New Jersey, really working very closely with their emergency management there is very important. We also can run interference for you. That sounds kind of odd. How in the world can AmeriCorps members run interference for a county emergency manager or a professional? Well, here's how. Great example. We train many of our teams, those 4,200 I mentioned, are trained in risk management training and technical assistance for hazards. In New Jersey, we had a group of well-meaning surfers. I don't know if there's any surfers in the crowd, but we had some well-meaning surfers come out, and they recruited some volunteers and started going in and offering their services to muck out and gut out homes in New Jersey. But they were going in homes that had not been properly assessed and had not had the performed the risk and hazard assessment yet. So the emergency manager from the state of New Jersey asked our AmeriCorps team, from the Washington Conservation Corps in this case, to go in. Will you go in and teach these surfers and their volunteers how to assess the risk in these homes so they won't do any damage that we're going to have to clean up and we won't have any accidents or incidents as a result. I thought that was great that they deployed the AmeriCorps teams to do so. That was a really quick resource. We could turn very quickly and respond to that. So I'm really, really, really pleased with that. I don't know how many people in the audience here are between the ages of 18 and 26. Not many, but I'm going to ask you to stand if there's anybody between the age of 18 and 26. One in the front row here, is that it? 2, 3 over here, another one, maybe another. All right, 3 or 4 folks. All right, 18 to 26. Wonder if our 18 to 26-year-olds, our millennials, have any assets that we could turn to that could help us in any kind of our work in disaster response or preparedness and mitigation. Wonder if there's any assets or resources that you all have that you could offer us. Well, FEMA thought there was. We thought there was too, in the form of AmeriCorps members between the age of 18 to 24, and that's when we partnered and started FEMA Corps. We train now up to 1,400 FEMA Corps members in this age group of 18 to 24 through 5 weeks of intensive training that FEMA provides, and our team does too. We position them in the 5 regions around the state, around the country. They put them in teams of 10, and then they go and respond. They do case management, community relations. They do some food distribution and water distribution, but theirs is really more, these are really more for those who are seeking a career in emergency management on the side of the community relations and the case management side, primarily, but we let them have some fun and do some exterior work too. This is really working, folks. Craig Fugate supported this. This was the vision of Rich Serino, the then Deputy Secretary for FEMA, and the President when this was announced, introduced as an idea to the President. And here's what happened as a result about it this morning. You heard our earlier speaker talk about a DSAT, Disaster Survivor Assistance Team. So what occurred, and I'm going to give credit to the FEMA senior professionals and the young FEMA Corps members equally. They worked at, this is what happens when you pair different age groups and different skill sets together. In Sandy, it was, it is awful hard to try to convince the public to go to something called a DRC. What in the world is that? I'm afraid of that. I'm a survivor. I don't know where to find that. I don't know what it is. It's something to do with government. And I don't even know how to get there. So it occurred to us, why don't we have technology. We have laptops. We have computers. The electricity is back on in most of these places now. We've got internet service. Why don't we take this technology to the people? Why don't we show up in where they're going back to? Why don't we show up at the grocery stores? Why don't we go door to door and show up? And this is what's happening here in this photograph. The FEMA Corps members are literally signing up survivors, connecting them with their assistants and registering them online, taking it to them. I actually did one of these in a garage in Moore, Oklahoma on a very hot day after about 60 days after the tornadoes hit Moore, Oklahoma. But this idea spawned because of the brilliance and genius of pulling together the millennials with the senior professionals at FEMA Corps. So I say that to you as an idea to encourage you. If you are not bringing young people into your fold, consider it. and it'll make you a stronger, more resilient organization as well. So this is the story I want to tell you in my closeout story. This is an absolutely fantastic story of recovery. In Joplin, a community of about 60,000, you know the story, a late May, tornadoes hit there, virtually devastating. If you've not been to Joplin, you've seen the photographs. Virtually devastating it. The state of Missouri, actually their lead agency for volunteer and donations management, I think it's ESF 6, I believe in their case, it's 15 in the state of Florida, but I think it's 6 there, is an AmeriCorps program called St. Louis Safety Corps. #1 AmeriCorps program in the country when it comes to disaster response. They're fantastic. The state called in the St. Louis Safety Corps immediately when the storm, they actually arrived on the scene before the sun rose that night, and they set up the documentation for all of the volunteer and donations management for the entire region of Joplin. 1 year later, I visited them. So the story at the end of the year, we had 350 AmeriCorps members serve in 1 year. They managed 75,000 volunteers who came from around the country. They also documented about 50,000 volunteers and their time and effort. While they didn't manage them, they documented their work. And they documented all the donations that were that came into the community. This was a total of proper documentation that could stand up to a FEMA audit of $17.7 million. That was the soft match and saved the state of Missouri and the city of Joplin $17.7 million. Now, if that doesn't make your community more resilient, I don't know what does, because they did not have to come up with those resources to do so. It is the best case that I've been able to find, and it's one I'm very proud of. So I submit to you that if it's done correctly, that national service can be a fantastic resource, working closely with volunteer management, working closely with your volunteer managers, and we want to help bring this to your community through grants, through partnerships, any way we can find a way to partner with you. And go to DSU, that's Disaster Services Unit, at CNS, Corporation for National Community Service.gov. If you use this email and say, we're interested, we want to know more about how we can communicate, partner with AmeriCorps and National Service. Our director is actually here. Kelly DeGraff is here today. We've got some brochures here as well to give you, and we want to partner with you, and we want to make sure that your community is more resilient through the hands of human capital support and our AmeriCorps and Senior Corps and our volunteers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. So you are now part of the universe of people who understand so well what a great pick Wendy was for her role and how she continues to be, and how anyone who has ever met Wendy knows that she would never hesitate to help you, whether it falls within the confines of this or any other area. So our next presenter is a professional engineer with more than 20 years consulting experience in structural engineering and building investigations. He served on the board of directors of the American Association for Wind Engineering and is a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, as well as the UK Wind Engineering Society. He is an assistant professor at the University of Florida's Department of Civil and Coastal Engineering, where his research has been focused on the mitigation of extreme wind damage to low-rise construction, particularly light-framed wood residential structures. Recently, his research has focused on tornado-induced loads, leading and participating in damage assessment forensic teams following the 2011 Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Joplin, Missouri tornadoes, as well as the 2013 Moore, Oklahoma tornado. He was recently awarded a National Science Foundation Career Research Grant to develop more tornado-resilient homes and communities. And let me just tell you one of the reasons that I recruited him to join us here today. Obviously, Dr. Dave Pravat has a lot to do and a lot of work focused squarely in his field of engineering. But because he cares about that bigger cause of helping all of us, whether we come from mitigation and communication and outreach, he has done something each and every time they deliver a survey or report after they have findings, looking across tornado to other high wind instances like hurricane or anything else. After the 2011 investigation that he and his team performed in the Tuscaloosa outbreak, he called me on the phone and said, I want you to take a look at the back of our report. There's a very, very important bit of information there. And it's that 90% of this damage happened well below the EF4 and 5. And he helped us understand that yes, in the EF4 and 5 tornadoes, there is terrific damage, and it's very difficult to affordably build to withstand it. And lives are lost. They don't have to be if there's a safe room, but that's another discussion. But the point that Dr. Pravat was making to us so that we could weave it into our messaging, and just in the last 2 months, this insight became the basis for a new kind of building code with tornadoes in mind in Oklahoma. What he pointed out to us is that we had to break through conventional thinking and help everyone in our movement understand that there are many things you can do in building with high wind, including in tornadoes. That lives could be spared and property could be saved in the outskirts of even the big outbreaks, and since the majority of the tornadoes are well below EF4 and 5, that this was a game changer. His contribution in picking up the phone, sharing very openly with all of us, participating after the outbreaks that we saw last year, again in Moore and in El Reno, have made a huge difference, and I know lives will be saved in the future. So I'd like to welcome up to the podium Dr. David Pravat.
Well, with that introduction, I ought not to be here at all. Thank you so much, Leslie. I've been working in the hurricane area for personal reasons. I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, grew up there, and we live with hurricanes. The difference between Trinidad or Jamaica or any other Caribbean island and Florida is that we don't have I-95. We can't evacuate, so therefore, of necessity, we have to, hunker down and grin and bear it, so to speak. The largesse of a 300 million country that comes to the aid of New York City or Moore, Oklahoma, that's not there. There's a lot more international provisions that have to go through for us to get going. But basically, I would like to start with the engineering perspective on all this. The fact is, a hurricane is an extreme event which completely disrupts our lives. But must it do so? The idea of that red dashed line is the disruption ought to be above that disaster threshold. How do we know where that threshold is and what can we do about that? I think it's a question of, as the first speaker mentioned, engaging a community to understand that this is fair game. This is about engineering. It's about knowledge that we have in the past and that we just have not applied so far. So our research right now is trying to develop homes that have lower vulnerabilities, higher resilience, and so therefore that they don't fall as far in the event itself, but they recover faster as you go forward. Florida truly has been the leader in terms of housing retrofits, and I will focus on housing. The same can be applied to civil infrastructure, bridges, roads, transportation, etc. The work at the University of Florida, Clemson University, Texas Tech, and others has truly changed the playing field and introduced all of the codes that we see going in terms of Florida and the performance of buildings. When we look back at Hurricane Charlie, we can see homes that were built in 94 to 98 period compared to the 99 to 2001 periods, and after 2002 to 2004. These dates were chosen specifically to represent when 2002 we had a building code change where Florida adopted the South Florida Building Code. Essentially what you're seeing here is on that left side, the roofs with no damage are in the 2002 homes are over 50%, as compared to older homes built 1994 to 1998, a mere 15% of homes had no damage. This message goes on over and over again. I think the idea that you and others in this conference are able to help with other is that the general public doesn't know this. They don't seem to accept that science has moved into the 21st century. We have solutions out there, and that they ought to take advantage of them. The solutions are not that expensive. Change a nail from a 6D 2-inch nail to a 2.5-inch nail, you have better performance. Make it a ring shank nail, the performance increases even more. Utilizing closed cell foam adhesive not only keeps your roof on, but it prevents water from getting into your house. These things exist. We don't have to reinvent this, and the message has to be, let's now implement it. We have heard that saying when we go to the dentist. I always ask my dentist, which is the best toothbrush I should use? Is the Colgate one or the Oral-B one? And basically she says, the one that you're going to use every day. That's the one you should use. Whether it's hard or soft, that doesn't matter, but you just have to do it. So right now, what we're trying to advocate is the retrofits that exist. Forgetting about any new innovative things that I can do, let's just use it. This study was done out of Clemson University by a colleague of mine, Wei Ching Pang, and his student, Dr. Grayson, who is graduating and actually joining the Florida folks in a short while. But they looked at a community. And to explain this chart, we're looking at the probability of damage along the horizontal axis. And if none of the homes in that community was retrofitted, the red line indicates all those homes which would be totally destroyed. If 25% of those homes were retrofitted, the number of homes destroyed would be reduced until just 50% of the homes need to be retrofitted before we have very minor damage or minor damage in the majority, over 70% of the homes. Right now, this is a probabilistic guess at the things, but if 100% of our homes were retrofitted, this is what we face. Very minor to minor damage in all our homes, in all our communities. Let's put that in perspective. Over the last year, or annually, we experience about $55 billion in disaster expenses, economic losses to the United States. What if that number were $5 billion? Couldn't we all think of a better way to use $55 or $50 billion going forward? There are some inhibitors we see to resilience, and it goes beyond what I can do. I can engineer things, but I can't communicate as Leslie and Wendy can, and Illya. I can't do that. We have to talk to people. We have to talk to a room full of this size and get those motivational speakers to make change happen. I can't do that. But I can be part of the solution by making it clear where those misunderstandings exist, and also pointing out some of the actual inhibitors. For instance, we have the best code. We know it. Florida building code is the best wind design code. But 70% of our buildings were built before Hurricane Andrew hit the state. That is to say, 70% of our buildings conservatively probably don't have those wind-resistant connections that we need to have a resilient community. I don't know how we're going to get there, but this is something that concerns me. And not only does it concern me as a structural engineer and a researcher, it's for a selfish reason. I pay taxes here. I pay into citizens' insurance here in Florida for my car insurance, for my home insurance. If we get another hurricane, this will affect us, okay? Other things that might be limiting our ability for resilience is our international residential code, our international building codes. Code officials are here. We all know what this means in code language to safeguard the public health and safety. That's a very curious choice of words. What does safeguard mean? When am I safe? When am I safe? Honestly, it safeguards my health, but not my financial health. Okay? The building code is not directed to safeguard the economic health of a community, and therefore that could be one of the inhibitors to resilience. Okay? The National Institute of Science and Technology recently held a workshop just last week, in fact, in DC, in which they were developing a standard for community resilience. This is a very big effort coming through the federal government, through the Presidential Directive 21. Looking at what can we do. We can no longer assume that simply reducing the loss of lives is sufficient. We actually have to address how to reduce and minimize the loss of actual treasure. In one of those ways we are addressing this is by introducing a dual-based tornado design philosophy, in that not only is life safety supposed to be part of the code, but we also want to identify the building performance issues that can minimize economic losses as we go through any tornadoes. And these papers and a series of papers which came out of Joplin and Tuscaloosa work especially, and have actually been applied to Moore, Oklahoma. And Wendy, you mentioned Moore. I am so pleased to announce that Moore is the first community after 3 large tornadoes in the last 14 years that they actually have introduced a building code for 135 mile per hour wind. Wow. That's a first, and we're very proud that that has actually happened. We've looked at tornadoes in Florida. We see some damage that I've seen in Tuscaloosa and Joplin. We've seen them in the villages in 2007. We've seen more recently in the last 2 or 3 years. When we look at the damage in Tuscaloosa versus Florida, Palm Coast, or Florida, the villages, they look the same. Let's not fool ourselves that just because we have this Florida building code, that all our buildings are going to survive. So therefore, what do we do? How do we get this message? At this point, I can stop doing any more engineering, just utilize what we've done in the last 50 years, and we will make substantial improvements in our performance. The message is we have to utilize, we have to engage those communities. I have to be a part of it. Contractors, building officials, everyone has to be a part of it. Okay. Here's how we can mend that chain. There is a gap between the existing knowledge and the benefits that a community must have. We know how the hurricanes perform. We understand the building resistance and the capacities as they are, and we've updated the codes accordingly. The codes affect those 3% of the buildings that get built every year. What about retrofits? Can we retrofit homes? Can we improve the way the homes, the existing 90% of homes perform? The benefits to our communities are the insurance discounts, less damage to homes, less disruption, neighborhoods remain intact, communities recover faster. Money is pumped back into the economies through things that they didn't have to spend, and the state of Florida itself is going to be in a better state for pretty much all things. The gap here is engagement. It is exactly what we're doing in this room, whereby me as a researcher and the engineers speak directly to these communities, go back to Joplin, go back to Tuscaloosa and tell them what they've done. And I'm pleased to also say that now there's an app for that. As Wendy said, engage the 26-year-old in the room, the one of four who stood up, Austin Thompson and his cohorts here, they developed an app called Resri. You know, there is an app for that. So essentially, here goes. Resilient Residence is a solution that, as we see going forward, the idea here is that we establish this iPhone app, give it to the homeowners so that you can identify your home location, where it's at, the value of the home, and as we step through this app, it'll guide you in terms of the retrofit that you need to do for your 95-year-old home, one-story home, and let's see, what do I need to do? What kind of shingle roof do I have? How old is it? Okay? This information exists, ladies and gentlemen, and this is what we need to do. We have to find a modern way in which we can engage a homeowner at that point when they're actually going to make changes. Before the hurricane, for instance, the time they're going to buy a house, they need to understand what their risks are. They also need to understand how much they expect to save. Okay? This app will enable us to help not only the homeowner, but the state itself. If we did this retrofit, we can reduce the damage by 50% in a Category 1 storm. Or what would happen in a Category 4 storm? This is the kind of information that not only individual homeowners need, but everyone in this room. So let's think about this. If we all in this room did that, and the resilientresidence.com is a website that you can go on. It's in beta form, unfortunately, now, so we aren't able to get it to you. But imagine the savings that we can make. Imagine the engagement, finally, to give someone that knowledge that it's not just some nebulous thing in the university. These are practical issues. These are issues which I will be able to use this app and link myself directly from this idea in my head to the contractor who can do the work, to the insurance company that will give me that premium reduction. What a concept. Out of the mouth of babes. PhD babes, but still babes. Okay? So that's it for me. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to participate. But the majority of my message here is I can do so much, but no more. As a researcher, I am 100% on board behind this, but it takes others to come in and to understand that. And this is what we've been trying to work with Flash, to work with others, to get that message out, that solutions are around the corner and that we can do it. So with that, I thank you.
Okay, so this is just a table full of ringers. Outstanding, Dave. So our final presenter, and after that we have 2 microphones, so hopefully you're writing down your questions and burning issues. And there you go. So that you can get involved in the conversation, because we're up against a break, so we have a little bit of wiggle room. Now, this is a gentleman that we've recently, just this past year, had the pleasure of starting to work with. He's the founder of Plus Lab Architects in Brooklyn. He's an associate professor at New York City College of Technology, and there he teaches architecture and resilient building strategies. He serves on both the American Institute of Architects New York Board, as well as the regional director for the Young Architects Forum. He just received the 2014 AIA National Young, seems to be a theme here today, Young Architects Award in recognition of his exceptional leadership and outstanding work in the early stages of his career. He's a consulting member of the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team and Housing Recovery Center in New York City and led the AIA Post-Sandy Initiative. He's an instructor in the Resiliency, Adaptation, Mitigation, and Planning program at Pratt Institute's National Disaster Training Preparedness Center in Hawaii. We got to hear more about that. And he's trained in post-disaster damage assessment by Cal EMA, has a background in geography, visual art, as well as architecture. For our part, we have had the pleasure of his volunteer service to an effort that we are coming close to completion on, to deliver a plus guide to the volunteer building and rebuilding universe, so that any small size structure can be plussed up to resilient in a way that's cost effective and efficient and dependable. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Illya Azaroff.
Thank you, Leslie. Hi, everybody. I'm learning a lot today. One, that there's an app for that, which is great. And the other is that I thought this was already something that was really cool to do. But anyway, so I'm happy to be here. And a couple of things. Before we get started, Leslie asked me to bring you a story. And the story is really this idea of the resilience revolution in New York, or perhaps my region. And to do that, I've got to take you on a little bit of a journey, a little bit of my story, engaging what's been happening up in New York, but a little bit before, during, and after the storm. So with that, this is then. And you may recall, all of you were affected by the storm in one way or the other, and that in my region, the familiarity of the loss of power, or the inundation that hit the entire region, or the poor building practices that we've purveyed over the last 20 years or 30 years, became glaringly obvious to us that we've done some ill to ourselves. And it was across these images that we begin to see how we can make a difference. Was it bad planning? Was it bad execution? Was it bad parking in this case? Or was it the fact that this was a great equalizer? It didn't matter where you lived. You were inundated. You were affected by this. And the way that the region was paralyzed was very evident, that we did not take the proper measures before. We knew this was coming. We knew it was going to happen. Yet we talked a lot about it. And that left us with disasters within the disaster, which we're experiencing yet today in the region. So that was then. So let me take you even further back to the pre-Sandy initiative. So post 9/11, New York City was on its toes. And my colleague and I, Lance J. Brown, we decided to start this initiative called the Design for Risk and Reconstruction Committee with the AIA New York chapter. So upon starting this, it was barely a year and a half before the Superstorm Sandy. And what we brought together was a full spectrum of people like yourselves in the audience: architects, planners, engineers, scientists, you name it, all around the table, meeting and putting on programs such as this. We talked about what the city needed to do to make a resilient city in 2080, climate change. We brought these things to the table, but then of course the storm hits. Now, the storm was something that began my personal story that you may be interested in. Within 24 hours, I was called to the OEM as part of the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team, and I found myself as one of two architects in the room that were not employed by the city government. That led to one quick discussion with the Department of City Planning and the mayor's office, and they said, can you activate the architects? Sure. So within that next 48 hours, I had 300 volunteers ready to go into the field for damage assessment, neighborhood assessment, and to help out. We have no Good Samaritan legislation in New York. That stopped very quickly. However, not to take our lemons and not make lemonade, we needed to do our next thing. The next was to take that energy of 300 people and put them to work. So with the help of Department of City Planning and the mayor's office, we decided to start this task force, the AIA New York Post-Sandy Task Force, with those 300 individuals and all of the people we met in the pre-Sandy initiative. All of those partnerships with institutions and the city came to fruition. We identified all of the areas that we needed to discuss. We looked at the waterfront, housing, critical facilities, transportation infrastructure. We created these buckets and we identified leaders. Those leaders took on those task forces and we began to critically look at those areas, but not in our own silos, in a way that was very dedicated to the entire city and perhaps the region. So you can see there that we worked with the APA, the ASLA, we worked with just about every acronym you can possibly imagine. And that paid dividends, because if you remember the storm, we put this document out in May following the storm, May of 2013. So this 44-page document, and I'm happy to announce that this just received national recognition for a Collaborative Achievement Award. This document, 44 pages long, was one of the first of its kind that came out. And I'm not going to take you through the whole document. What's important here is that we followed through as not just an industry, but an outreach group outside of our silos. We recognize that to be successful, you must collaborate, and to be successful, the end goal is something that unifies you, and you can't be afraid of the discussion. So that's where we took this. And you can see we hit critical facilities, waterfront, and all the way down. But the highlights are that we recognize that we have a defenseless city. Our city is not accustomed to getting hit by hurricanes. Every once in a while, a storm happens. Every once in a while, we're at risk. But we have a city that is old. Its infrastructure is old. The buildings are old. What does that mean? We're not up to the current building code, nor are we up to the 1960s building code for most of our buildings. We also looked at long-term goals, and I'm not going to go over those with you, but these are the ones that the city really valued. How can we take this storm and make for a better place to live for the next 100, 200, 300 years? So in terms of transportation infrastructure, very overarching topic. We want to make sure that the infrastructure such as this, it operates before, during, and after the storm. Very simple, but very hard to execute, as you know. Next, in terms of critical and commercial facilities, this is a very dense built environment. The challenge is not new buildings. The challenge is retrofitting these old buildings. And these old buildings are very robust, masonry buildings, most of them. The next item is the waterfront. We have long since gotten away from the fact that New York, New Jersey, and that harbor is one of the most beautiful freshwater estuaries in the entire world, yet we've paved it over. The water went exactly where it was supposed to, if you listen to Mother Nature, and so we have to recognize how we treat the waterfront and how we treat the ecology is going to benefit us in the end. Now, housing is one thing I am going to take a moment and talk about, because this is the chapter that will be successful or will break us in the Northeast. So in terms of housing, 400,000 people were displaced from their houses in New York City. Most of this housing was low-rise, 1- and 2-family. But there was no plan in place to displace them. A lot of our emergency management shelters were in the flood zones. Many were not. Many were in schools that further displaced children that could no longer go to school for that week or two after the storm. So this is sort of what we had to get at, is how do we change the way of thinking? How do we change this way? We also recognize that although there's great not-for-profit groups ready to go, they lacked the training in New York and the region for this type of an event. So we want to be at the forefront of training those people to get them out there. We also identified gaps in some of the floodproofing guidelines that really were not addressed in our building code. There's also this idea that, you know what, the multi-unit housing did well in New York City, because these big, heavy masonry buildings for an inundation event and a wind event probably would do fine. However, the critical facility and infrastructure in the buildings all failed. So we need to retrofit all of those buildings. And then when it comes down to it, we have gotten to a point where all of these recommendations have now been taken into account. We've been working with a lot of the FEMA representatives that are here in the room, some of the conference, and we've been able to inform the process. We're constantly putting codes and testifying at City Council to change the way that we do things in New York, and we have had a lot of success with that. So the one thing that I've got to leave you with this portion of my story is that this document can be downloaded at that website, which is designforrisk.com. It's 44 pages, and by the way, it's continuously being updated because this is a living document. Every new piece of information that we find as a working group, we will put in this document, and we're going to continuously share that. So the other thing about New York, we're a bunch of myopic, self-centered people in New York. I've got to tell you that because we have all the answers. You know, we invented disaster. Didn't you know that, right? In fact, because we don't have disasters, we thought, oh, let's go ahead and now we have to do all these new things. They're not new things. Where do we fit globally and how do we get our answers is something that New Yorkers were just floored by. Unless you really worked in disaster and understood that everybody had the answers every place else, we just didn't need those answers until now. So where are we globally? This is what we talk about in New York. You probably know these things, but from 2012, this is Sandy's year. So you've got right here, 32.4 million people displaced worldwide from natural disasters. And that's including Sandy, plus the 28.8 million people from man-made disasters. And so together we're looking at, that shouldn't read 91, should read 61.2 million people displaced annually, or for that year. So that's where New York fits. It fits with every one of you. It fits with every place on the planet. We're no different. In fact, we are so far behind other places, there's really a wake-up call. So let's go back to the regional scale. This is the other place where I'm really, really concerned. And this is where I'm starting to spend my efforts because New York and New Jersey don't get along all that often, especially politically, and now we have to share a bunch of funds. We have a hard enough time building bridges together so we can get from one state to the other, and now how do we do that with all of this Sandy funding and going to be prepared for the next 100 or 200 years? We have to build barriers? No, you're going to build a barrier, I'm going to build a barrier. No, you build a barrier. I'm going to let the water in. What do you mean you let the water in? If I let the water in, you drown. So this is what we have to deal with in New York and New Jersey and in the region. So it's the regional scale that we've jumped to. You guys know that this went up the coast. It went through the region as well as the Caribbean, and you can take a look. You know, the 95,000 people that registered for emergency housing in New York and New Jersey, that's just a drop in the bucket compared to the 650,000 houses that were affected in all 13 states up the coast. Yet, we couple that with Irene, which was the year before. Weren't these supposed to be 100-year events? That total misnomer, right? So if you couple those things together, where are we at? Well, this is exactly where we're at. And here's the greatest concern, because I don't care if you live in Florida or in California, 20% of our GDP is in that little Boston-Washington corridor. And that is the point of this, because it is all exposed. There is very little robustness there, and there's very little redundancy. So our work ahead of us lies in this one map. This is where the imperative of the 21st century lies. And it's not just with architects, it's everyone in the room. This is our work. And if we don't do this, we're all in trouble. So this is our response. The Regional Recovery Working Group, similar to that first group that I helped start, has just gotten its feet going. We have been conducting workshops throughout the 4-state region, and we're going to keep going. The last one was on March 31st for coastal communities. We sold out 150 people in 4 days and had 100 people on the waiting list. And this was in a small, tiny town in Long Island. People came from Rhode Island as well as southern coastal New Jersey to come to this. Not only is there a need to get this information to people, there is a total desire to help. So there's not a lack of people who want to be involved. These are the few organizations we had involved. We had Colonel Paul Owens as our keynote that day, talking to us about the entire regional reconstruction from the standpoint of the federal government all the way to Hank Ovink from HUD. It's really great to have all these speakers there. Now, this brings us to this last part of our story. Where are we now in New York? Well, metaphorically, this is where we're at. Either you're lifting your house or deciding what to do in some sort of way, and that's where we're at. We're answering these questions. Do we raise, do we stay, or do we retreat? The other things we're answering are, do you let the water in, keep it out, or just ignore it? And nobody has a consensus answer, and that has to go through the entire region, not just my neighbor next door to me, that's everyone. But just take a look at this map, and I want you to hold this image in your mind. Just burn it in for a second. Here's inundation with sea level rise 2050. And now take a look at our brownfield sites. So if we were going to say let the water in, which I really respect Hank Oving for saying that in the last New York Times, he's a friend of mine, and I agree we should be letting the water in. But when we do that, we have to recognize that brownfield sites and salt water don't mix. This is an ecological disaster waiting to happen, along with the other things. So as I said before, you had 2 million people without power after Sandy, and you had 11 million travelers affected and $11 billion worth of loss, which is an economic loss that keeps continuing to this day. But the other frightening thing is how wrong were the FEMA maps that were, or at least they were not updated. Shouldn't say wrong, because they actually did go, the water went where they said it was going to go, plus a little bit. But here's the thing. We had 35,000 buildings predicted in those flood zones. They all carried insurance or were supposed to have insurance. Now we have 67,000 buildings in those zones that didn't have to have insurance before. So I'm starting to paint a picture for you that we have a real serious economic issue where neighborhoods are going to lose their footing in what a neighborhood was, and that's currently underway. You also can see that high-rise buildings here did really well. Yes, they did really well, except if you lived on the top floor, you lost your ability to have fresh water because it's all electrically pumped to the top and then comes down, and you lost the elevator. So if you are debilitated or elderly, you are stuck. And by the way, someone who you mentioned about snow or winter. Yeah, it snowed 1 week after the storm. You might have forgotten, but we got a nice blanket of snow with all those people without power. So housing, I told you I'd come back to this, is say that there is the local and national regulations related to housing in the flood zones. It does not address the conditions in New York because of our density. The other things, here's the age and construction of our housing stock does not meet current building codes or the codes that of the 1960s. I'm not joking. We have not had our coast scrubbed by storms for so long that we have buildings that were built ad hoc. And I'm going to show you a couple of those. So the mitigation process, as you know, we're lifting houses. But here is how people are going to decide whether their neighborhood is viable. So here's the flood insurance. If I don't have enough money to lift my house, I'm going to be paying $9,500 per year for flood insurance for a $250,000 house, which, by the way, doesn't exist in New York City. I'm going to show you a house that you're going to be shocked at the price. But if I get up to the BFE, I'm now at $1,400, and if I go above, I'm at $427. That's great. That's all great information, but this is telling people that they cannot live there anymore. The majority of the people in the flood zones can't afford this. They can't afford the lift all the way to the right, and they can't afford to stay where they're at. And there's no way out. That is the problem. Now, if we do lift, here's our streetscape, and here's all the wonderful things that can happen. But is this the neighborhood that we want to live in? Because we're seeing these as little vignettes of a single house, and that's not really what New York is. This is put out by Breezy Point Cooperative. This is exactly what they have drawn up, what their neighborhood will look like. That's the neighborhood, because it's narrow walkways. I have 2 clients, actually now 3 clients there. They don't want to live there based on this drawing. They want to live the way it was before. So our work is ahead of us. But if we do find a way to make it aesthetically pleasing, just like this one, what happens to accessibility? Because accessibility just went out the window, not just for the single family house. We're having to really re-examine what multifamily housing is and how we get up and out of the flood zone in a very meaningful way. Moving the equipment, that's an easy one, but who's going to pay for it? Is it the shareholders of the building, the renters, the building owner? Are we applying for that for federal funding? That has to happen in every building in the flood zone, 90,000 inundated buildings, every one of them, great. We also have zoning laws that were relaxed so we can usually put it on the roof. Thank God it wasn't a wind event, right? But here is the hidden factor. So now that you've seen that the streetscape is changing for all of those small houses. New York has all these big, robust houses. This is the lobby of a really expensive building overlooking the Hudson. This used to be in what was the cellar that was inundated. Now they've brought all of the equipment in the lobby space. So now I walk in the lobby space. I have clients in this building, so as they walk in the lobby space, they see this. It'll be covered up, but those sumptuous lobbies are now changing the way that living is, changing the whole vocabulary of what you're looking at. So everyone's affected. Here's my case studies. These are real buildings that I'm working on now. We have 3 clients in Breezy Point. We told the first one, tear it down. She said, you're right, let's tear it down. That's good for her. The other 2 said, no, we're gonna go ahead and lift, or maybe lift. So, whoops, sorry. So this is Breezy Point. You see that little orange dot down there for those of you not familiar with New York City? Well, here we go. This is a really wonderful community, but it's a cooperative community. You own the building, you own shares in the land. So the land is governed by the entire community. If I want to change something on my building, I don't go to the building department. I go to people on the board of directors of my cooperative, then I go to the building department after they say it's okay. So here are the two. One is Pelham Walk, the other one is Ocean Avenue. We're going to start with Pelham Walk. So Pelham Walk is a beautiful little tiny bungalow that has not changed since the 1950s. My client bought it in the 1950s when he retired from the Navy. And this is this little beautiful house, right? It has asbestos on the exterior siding that's covered up with aluminum siding. It has lead paint all throughout it. And its structure underneath are 2x6 joists, floor joists that span the entire floor of the building. So all of you in the rooms are aghast. That is every building in this neighborhood and most of the buildings in the inundation zone. So when I say tear it down to my client, I know that that's really good because none of these conform to energy code, none of them are efficient, and they're all toxic waste sites. So when I said we go back to the idea of brownfields, every one of these small buildings is a brownfield site waiting to happen. Because as sea level rises, that is the first thing to go. So this little lovely house, he doesn't want to tear it down, he wants to lift it. The reason he wants to lift it is because it's the first house he ever owned, his children grew up there, and now his grandchildren go there. Great. So we are working with him, he's a client, and I love him to death. I've had him for a client for a long time. So this is what his place is gonna look like. He is 71 years old. So this year he'll be 72. Accessibility for him will become a problem, even though he's in excellent shape. This is not fair to anybody who is in this zone to not give them the true story. Here's the second one, Ocean Avenue, and this will be our last part of the story that we're at. Now, Ocean Avenue is a different couple, larger piece of property. It's instead of the 800 square foot, by the way, that first one was 800 square feet. This one is 1,200 square feet. It's a couple. They're in their early 60s. Oh, by the way, asbestos all around the entire outside, lead paint on the inside. However, the difference is the structure is viable because it was built by the owner's father, who was a structural engineer, and it's a really robust building. Excellent, well done. Here's the unfortunate thing. It is 4 inches below the flood elevation. 4 inches below. Remember when you saw that for 9,500 all the way up? These houses, that little bungalow was worth over $500,000 pre-Sandy. This one is worth almost $700,000 pre-Sandy. So when you talk about scale in New York City, you look at a property that you could probably buy in Mississippi for a fraction of that, and you look at New York and you say, what? How much am I spending on flood insurance? These people can't live in these places, and our solution is not there for them. That's what is happening in New York City. So even though the mayor said we're going to sort of hold back the tides in his speech, we are going to go ahead and not abandon the waterfront, and instead we must build stronger and more resilient. I agree with that. Build stronger, more resilient, but decide where you're going to build so we don't put the burden on the next generation or we put our environment at risk. And we're not the only player in town, and that's the good news. Everybody wants to work on this together, and we have reached out and been able to make a difference. So with that, my Resilient Revolution message is complete. And there are more chapters to come. And every one of you in the room, I invite you to join us at DFR, or I'll join you guys, because that next chapter has to be written together. We can't do it alone. Thank you very much.
I probably shouldn't say this, but I think this is my favorite panel ever. You guys are just fantastic. Okay, Barb and Tammy are back there with microphones, and these lights are a little bit blinding, but would anybody like to ask a question or chime in on the conversation? Do we have any takers? Of course, he's in the middle. It's all good. And would you please tell us your name and where you're from?
Hi, Tim Keebler, South Florida. I noticed in your presentation where you showed the map of the world that showed the people that have been affected by man-made or natural occurrences, how many people were affected across the globe. I did see that Europe was, there were no numbers in the European countries. Can you explain that?
Just a minute. Is this on?
We have these table mics turned back on now. We were getting a little, they are on.
I do believe that All of the data was collected from not-for-profit organizations, UN organizations, and Doctors Without Borders. And there's 2 slides missing from this because I didn't want to go on too long. There's 2 slides that show the areas of the world that are not affected, and I generally say, well, then we should move all there because those are so safe. But then the other part of it is I question the data because of how the data is reported and tabulated. We have other sources that looked at 2012 that had almost 90 million people displaced, not just 60 million people. So I'm more than happy to give you the resources for that data, and we can go and take a look at it, because in 2012 there was a lot of heat-related disaster in Europe, flooding and inundation, and displacement based on that. So it should be there.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right. What other questions, burning issues? Got one right back there. This is the exercise portion of our program for our microphone helpers.
This question is for the architect whose name I can't even come close to pronouncing. The group that you formed, that sort of grassroots group, how did the interplay and interface with the NDRF go through that recovery process? Where did you guys plug into the national response or recovery framework?
Most of our initial response was directly with the city, and because we were embedded with the OEM, it just started to grow from there. And then at the state level, we worked with Governor Cuomo's 2100 group. After they had written the reports, we were part of the review process, and then any of the relief efforts that sort of have continued since then, our group's been part of that conversation, or at least asked to be part of the commentary portion. So it's really been, the initial grassroots part that we had made the connections with city government had sort of bloomed from there. Did that answer your question?
That would be Illya Azaroff. Now I need to just add something to that. We have found one of the most energizing new groups of partners we've encountered in recent years are the architects. So I would just tell you, in your communities, if you're not working closely with the architects, you should. They are fantastic, very committed, and have lent tremendous effort to the work that we're doing. Do we have any other questions, comments? Barb, you have somebody?
Hi, I'm George McAleese from the Lessons Learned Information Sharing website. My question is for Ms. Spencer. Have you found any techniques or tactics that you found to be particularly effective in convincing communities and localities to accept assistance from these volunteers who I imagine are often coming from out of state?
From out of state, one of the best ways that we've been able to find success is emergency managers talking to each other. And so that is one great example. I need the advocate. I need Tuscaloosa, Joplin, all of Florida, throughout Hurricane Sandy, West Texas, Moore, Oklahoma, Boulder, Colorado. I'm meeting with all of these emergency managers and leaders and mayors across the country and traveling to meet with them and talk to them about the aftermath. And I'm asking them to share in their circles why, because they're telling me, how great the experience has been, but they're learning it on the fly often. So, because they didn't prepare in advance, they didn't have pre-positioned national service programs in advance. So they're learning it very much aftermath, and then they are sharing it. But we are having some training, like Tuscaloosa was able to help with Joplin. Joplin also learned, and I might get it wrong, Texas. We had Texas that also partnered as well. So we're having this sharing going on, that they're calling each other as soon as they get hit. They're calling the previous disaster manager to find out, what the best practice is. So it's not great. We have about 12 states in the country that are acting. The state governors' commissions, or the AmeriCorps program, the commission that runs the AmeriCorps program, is the emergency support function for volunteer and donations management in a formal partnership. That is where we see our best practices, is when you've got that arrangement and that collaboration done in advance. So we're spending, Kelly particularly is spending a lot of time training, nonprofit leaders in these states, the state governors commissions and others on these practices so they can share it. So we've got work to do because we're finding that way too many communities are learning really late when they should. We've got all the practices, we've got all the lessons learned, and you've got your book of them from your lessons learned report, and there's no reason for us to try to write this as we're in the middle of the disaster.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question or comment. Do we have anybody else? All right, well then, please join me. Oh, we do? Sorry, the sun is up on that side. We can't see over there.
Well, I just wanted to comment that you early on opened with it's important for experts to work together. And Illya, you really brought that home, how successful it is when they do, because there are some difficult questions. As you pointed out, do you raise the home? Do you not? Do you let the water in? Do you not? And when you bring all the stakeholders to the table, you get a real clear picture of what we're dealing with. So indeed, your efforts of bringing the experts together is very important, and you will get a real clear picture of what you're dealing with in regards to mitigation and resiliency.
Kia, is that you? Yes. I thought it was. I can't see you, but I knew it was you. All right, listen. Thank you, everyone. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for just phenomenal presentations. And Max asked me to remind you that we will reconvene in this room at 3:30 for the awards ceremony. Thank you again.